we now come to the aftermath of Samson's marriage to the Philistine. And it's not a pretty story. Having made that mistake, of course, of marrying outside, you have to live with the consequences. And the consequences, as we have just read, were ugly. So we've come to consider in this session the life of Samson in a period of great turbulence. And we found him, of course, here in the valley of Sorek. Looking west towards the land of the Philistines, this is Samson's view from the area of Zorah, looking down the valley of Sorek. It's going to play a big part in his life, this valley, in the next little while. Down there at Timnath, of course, he's left behind a wife, or at least he thinks he's left behind a wife, because she's been given away to his best man. And so he's going to get a bit of a surprise when he wants to go back to her. Now, just reminding you of what this section of Scripture is really about. It's about the oscillation of Samson's life between these two places with which he was very familiar. He was born and raised in Zorah, but just north was Eshtaol, and we've seen how these two names play a part in his life. Eshtaol, to appeal, to entreat of the range of voices that are working in this man's life, very often, of course, in the wrong direction. And, of course, Zorah, the striking down, the power of the Spirit that God brings into this man's life to overcome his problems and to occasionally rescue him from his own folly. So there's some very real lessons to be learnt from those two names, as we've already seen. But when you come to verse 1 of chapter 15, you find this man betrayed by so-called friends. It came to pass within a while after. We don't know how long that was, but probably wasn't all that long. In the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. And he said, I will go in to my wife into the chamber. Now, within a while means, of course, that the time came when the same physical urges that had caused him to go down and to take this woman as a wife returned and drove him back. And sometimes, that's the case, isn't it? Physical urges can swamp spiritual things, spiritual anger that he showed in the destruction of 30 Philistines in the previous chapter. When God rescued him, that's now forgotten, that's pushed aside. It is so typical of human experience, this. And we're all, of course, subject to the very same passions. And we go through similar cycles. Maybe not as serious, but we go through similar cycles as what Samson did. A kid, of course, as he takes down a kid, is a gift. It's going to be his way of apologising for the events that have occurred in the previous chapter and maybe get back on the right side of this woman's father and her as well. When he mentions chamber here, it says, I will go into my wife into the chamber. This is not just the living room or the lounge room. This is an inner room. He means a bedroom. And of course his intentions are clear, aren't they, as to what he's looking for. He's going to now consummate this marriage, or perhaps continue it. And that is what he wants. It's not going to happen. Because when he gets there, her father would not suffer him to go in. Her father has given this girl away. So he offers an alternative to Samson. He says to him, I thought you utterly hated her, which wouldn't be an unreasonable conclusion to make, would it? Given the fact that he's just gone out and killed 30 Philistines and then rushed off in the heat of anger. Not an unreasonable conclusion to come to. You hated her, so what are you back here for? I gave her away to someone else. And so he says, I've got another daughter. Anyway, look, the other daughter is prettier than the one you married. So he offers a substitute. You read that story, young people, and you say, well, what's that in the record for? Well, I'll tell you what it's there for. It's therefore to teach a very important lesson. If you play around with the world, you're not dealing, in the main, with people who are imbued with a desire to follow the principles of Almighty God. And that's the kind of treatment that they will deal out, for the most part. There will be all sorts of actions, dishonest and otherwise, that will frustrate you. That's what this is teaching us. If you want to deal with the world, expect that kind of treatment from it. That's the way it behaves. It doesn't behave in the way that you will want them to behave, in the way that we are supposed to behave. That's how it behaves. And so Samson's going to find he's got some lessons to learn here. And so have we. Don't put your confidence in man or in what the world can offer. So, what does he do? Verse 3. Samson said concerning them, "Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure." As the RSV puts it, this time I should be blameless. See, he came to apologise. But now he says, no, they've frustrated me. So I'm going to take it out on them. I'll be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do the mischief. And so he has an intention to make life very hard for them as they've made it for him. And so what does he do? Verse 4. He went out and caught 300 foxes, it says, in the AV. Now, foxes here actually is jackals. The Hebrew word, shual, means a jackal, as a burrower. In other words, even foxes dig holes. But this is a burrower. But the difference between a fox and a jackal is that foxes are solitary, so they don't sort of hang around in packs, whereas jackals are gregarious. They tend to gather in groups, which means it would be easier to catch them if they're in groups. They're also very cowardly, and they eat carrion, rotting meat. So the lowest order, you might say, of the animal world in that category. So he goes out and he catches 300 of these jackals. Now, for a start, this couldn't be done by a man with the powers of a man. This is another case where Yahweh obviously gives Samson the strength required to do something really quite miraculous, to catch 300 of these animals, to tie their tails together and a firebrand on it and let them loose into the standing corn of the Philistines. Now, 300 is an interesting fact, because the number 3 in Scripture, when we first learn of it in Genesis chapter 1, is in the context of fruit. The earth bringing forth fruit after its kind, from trees and herbs, etc. Bringing forth fruit after its kind. And the word fruit occurs 3 times in Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. It tells us something. 3 is the number of a result, getting some kind of outcome, fruit. And so what we have here is 300. In other words, a full complement. You have the same number used in a way, 3, in the number 30, the 30 Philistines that were killed in chapter 14. When you go a little bit further on, you have in verse 11 of Judges 15, 3,000 men of Judah. So we got 30 Philistines, 300 jackals, and 3,000 men of Judah. Why the emphasis on 3? Well, it's telling us it's a full complement. So he gathers together these jackals in order to decimate the crops of the Philistines. Now, the word that's used here for firebrands, you have a look at it, says in verse 4, he went out and caught 300 jackals and took firebrands and turned tail to tail. That word firebrands in the Hebrew is lapid. Now, it only occurs 14 times in the Old Testament, and in some very significant contexts. For example, in Judges chapter 7 and verse 16, Gideon says, "You do as I do," to his, how many? 300 men, which is a full complement. You see, they represent the saints in the time when Christ will go out to destroy the power of the nations, because Judges chapter 7 is really about Armageddon. And so when you read about these 300 men, they had to take lamps within their pitchers. Now, lapid, the Hebrew word here, means to shine as a lamp, and a flame will shine. And so here we have a word that has to do with spirit power again. That's why you find this word used in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 13, in the context of the cherubim. Now, we know what that chapter's about. Ezekiel chapter 1 is about the saints immortalised, who go forth with Christ to overthrow the power of the nations. Daniel chapter 10, verse 6 is another reference where this word lapid is used. It's in the vision of what we know as the man of the one. What's that about? Well, it's about Christ and the saints going out in judgment against the nations. See? So this is the way this word is used. Only 14 times in the Old Testament. And so it's used significantly here. This is a form of divine judgment. Fire, of course, being the symbol in the Word of God for judgment. So we've got these animals that are tied together, and divine judgment is going to be wreaked upon the Philistines through their behaviour. And of course what happens, of course, is they run off into the fields and they catch fire, and well, the rest is history. Their crops were destroyed. So let's have a look at this word. It's used, as I said, in Judges 7:16. It's actually used of Abraham's burning lamp, or at least the burning lamp that represented Yahweh, that passed between the pieces in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 17. It's used in Isaiah 62 verse 1 of the lamp of salvation, as I said in Ezekiel 1 and again in Daniel chapter 10. That is the context in which this word lapid is used, firebrands. So we have no doubt at all as to what it represents here. Divine judgment against the Philistines. And look what happens. It says in verse 5, at the end of the verse, or towards the middle of the verse, that he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the stocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. Now that's a pretty full list, isn't it? It's from the beginning of harvest, so to speak, to the end of harvest, because you began your barley and wheat harvest at the beginning of the season, and you ended it with the vineyard and the olive trees. So this is going to wrap up all of their work into one judgment and destroy the lot in one go. So off they went. So we've got the standing corn about to be reaped. You know, it's a little bit like the fields that Joab had burnt by Absalom. Remember that? He got very angry about that. The shocks, it says here. Now the word shocks in the Hebrew means to heap up. So some of the grain had already been harvested, and they heaped it up, ready to take it away and thresh it, you see. Well, I didn't get to thresh it. It got burnt up. Then there's the vineyards. Pretty hard to burn green things, isn't it? But the violence of the flame was such that it destroyed the vineyards of the Philistines. And the olives. There's oil in olives too, isn't there? So oil does tend to burn. So they went up too. The whole thing. This was about the economic ruin of the Philistines by a man imbued with the power of God, shining forth the lapid, the lamp of divine judgment. Guess what, young people? It's about to happen again. When Christ comes and raises the dead, takes those of us who are alive and remain, and puts together his army, just like Gideon put together his 300, they will have divine judgment in their hand, and they will go forth to bring economic ruin to the civilization in which we live, sweep it away that it might be replaced. So even in that, there's a little hint for us that it can be one or the other. You could have the terrible experiences that Samson has gone through because of his folly, but you can be lifted out of that. If you will let God work, you can be lifted out of that to end up in a place that you can't even begin to imagine the glory and the beauty of. So that this is the story of Samson, isn't it? It flip-flops from one side of the spectrum to the other so frequently. So much, of course, is true of human life generally, and especially those in whom the truth is trying to work. It's all too often a flip-flop situation. But in the end, God won in the life of Samson, and he can win in our life as well. Now the Philistines are pretty upset about this. Verse 6, and the Philistines said, "Who's done this? Who on earth has done this?" And they answered and said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and they burnt her and her father with fire. So just like Samson, they're going to exact revenge. It was poetic justice, wasn't it? Because back in the record. Remember, verse 15 of chapter 14, it said, came to pass on the seventh day, they said to Samson's wife, entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. So she sets about to extract the riddle. She gets it. She's still burnt with fire. So poetic justice falls on the head of Samson's wife and her family. So what does he do? Verse 7. And Samson said unto them, though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. Well, he's got that one wrong too. The RSV translates it, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged upon you, and after that I'll quit. No. In this battle, you never quit. The word ceasing has that idea of quitting. You can never quit in this war, young people. As we quoted a little earlier, the proverb, there is no discharge in that war until Christ comes or until you die. There is no discharge in the fight against the rollers in the dust. Human nature has to be wrestled with. There has to be a continuing battle with it. There is no such thing as ceasing, quitting, until our nature is changed. That's the principle that comes out of this. So he thinks he's going to get rest. No, sorry, Samson. It doesn't happen that way. So verse 8, he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Rotherham says leg on thigh. The idea is of piling them up. Now, back in Genesis 32, verse 11, when Jacob was preparing to meet Esau, his great concern was that Esau would send in his men and butcher his family. And he talks about the mother being killed over the child. Similar idea. You know, the mother would go try and protect the child, and they're both killed anyway, but there would be leg on thigh. And so he piles up the Philistines, or he's going to pile up the Philistines, he says, leg on thigh. And of course, it's exactly what happens a little later on, as we're going to see. It says he went down. He went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Etam. While in verse 9 it says that the Philistines went up. Well, yeah, think about that. Samson was going down to find protection. Well, he wasn't going to get it because his own brethren were going to give him up to the Philistines. So here we've got this rock, this Selah, lofty, craggy rock, high up. He thought he would find protection here. It's called Etam, hawk ground, or lair of wild beasts. In other words, it's not really a safe place, because there are wild beasts that hang around these sorts of places. Birds of prey that want to pluck the flesh of bodies. And so it wasn't to prove to be a very safe place at all. The only safe place was back in Zorah, where the Spirit would work in his life. So we have the reaction of the Philistines and of the men of Judah in verse 9. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and spread themselves in Lehi. And the men of Judah said to the Philistines, why have you come up against us? And they answered, to bind Samson are we come up, to do to him as he hath done to us. Now this place Lehi is going to play a very important part in the story to the end of chapter 15. Lehi means a jaw. The root of the word means a jawbone. And of course you all know that he's going to pick up a jawbone of an ass and kill 1,000 Philistines with it. So Lehi is going to be an important place in the history of Samson's life. Now the men of Judah said, what are you doing to us? To the Philistines. Why have you come up? And the Philistines said, because of Samson. Then verse 11 says, then 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock Etam and said to Samson, don't you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this that you've done to us? Now, I want to just spend a little bit of time on this, young people, because it's very important in the story of what happens here. The men of Judah are adopting a peace at any price policy with the Philistines. And it's extremely dangerous to do that. They should have been behind Samson. They should have supported him in his work of overthrowing the Philistines, not compromising with them. See, the true role of Judah's leaders is that spelled out in Zechariah chapter 12 verse 6. And this is about the future, the near future for us, at the time of Armageddon. In that day will I make the governors of Judah like a hearth of fire among the wood, says Zechariah, and like a torch of fire in a sheaf. We've been looking at torch of fire and sheaf, haven't we? And they shall devour all the people round about, on the right hand and on the left, and Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. In other words, the men or the governors of Judah, the rulers of Judah, who turn up here at the rock Etam, should have come and said to Samson, now listen, we'll join you in your warfare against the Philistines, and together as one we can defeat them. But they came down and said, we want to put you in irons, we're going to tie you up and take you and deliver you up to the Philistines. Great support, eh? So there's a lesson to be learnt from this. This bunch of 3,000 men of Judah were more than enough with Samson and with God's help to overthrow the Philistine oppression of 40 years. They could have done it together. But no, they had decided to capitulate. The Philistines, they said, are rulers over us. Well, hang on. I thought this is the ecclesia. Who should be a ruler over the ecclesia of God? Philistines? No. Yahweh should have ruled over them. What have you done to us? They said. So it's all about self-interest. It's about their peace. It's not about defending the truth or upholding what was right. It's not about God. It's about them. And that, of course, is the way human beings operate, isn't it? Usually, first, number one, about me. So they're sitting on the fence, these people. Now, when was the last time you sat on the fence? Nice sharp iron fence. Find it comfortable? No, fence sitting's never comfortable, and it's never very successful. It's far better off getting on one side or the other. So here we've got a bunch of the leaders of Israel who are saying, we want to compromise with the world. Now, tragically, it's been repeated in history many, many times. And I'll let you decide about the times in which we live. We cannot afford to sit on the fence. I want you to come back to Joshua chapter 23. Now here we've got Joshua at the end of his life calling the elders of Israel together. And he wants to tell them about their responsibilities to their God and to their people. So we pick the record up in Joshua 23 verse 6. This is what he says. Notice it's the rulers he calls together in verse 2. Joshua called for all Israel and for their elders and for their heads and for their judges and for their officers. So it's the ruling class in Israel. It's the ones who have responsibility to guide and to lead others. And he says this in verse 6. Be ye therefore very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that ye turn not aside therefrom to the right hand or to the left. You reckon that the rulers of Judah in Judges chapter 15 are being courageous for the truth? No. Verse 7. That ye come not among these nations that remain among you, neither make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause to swear by them, etc. Verse 8. But cleave unto Yahweh your God. Verse 9. For Yahweh hath driven out from before you great nations and strong. He can do it again. Verse 10. One man of you shall chase 1,000. Interesting. One man is about to chase 1,000 in Judges chapter 15, isn't he? With a jawbone of an ass. He's going to hack off a lot of heads with a jawbone. One man of you will chase 1,000. For Yahweh your God, he it is that fighteth for you, as he hath promised you. Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves, because you can get it wrong, that ye love Yahweh your God. Else if you go back, he says, and cleave to the remnant of these nations that remain among you, and the Philistines were one of them, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you, know for a certainty that Yahweh your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, for there'll be snares, etc. Now that is what Joshua said to the elders of Israel. And here we have, in Judges chapter 15, and we go back to Judges 15, a bunch of 3,000 men of Judah who are going up saying, we're compromisers. We're fence-sitters. We're not interested in defending the truth, Samson. We're interested in keeping the peace. We don't want to have fights and wars with the Philistines. Leave us alone. Let them leave us alone. So you are going to be the sacrificial lamb. We're going to take you up and let them deal with you. You're our problem, really. Great support, isn't it? Terrific. So they say to him in verse 12, Judges 15, and they said unto him, we've come to bind you, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said, now listen, protect yourselves. Now really binding Samson was Philistines' work, not the work of the men of Judah. Excuse me. And so he knows that he can't trust these people. So what he says is, and I'll come back to that in a minute, what he says is this in end of verse 13, and Samson said unto them, swear unto me that you will not fall upon me yourselves. Because what he's really saying to them is, if you decide to take action to deal with me, then you might find yourself on the wrong end of things. Because he would defend himself. So he gets an oath out of them that they won't touch him. Now Brother Roberts in Nazareth Revisited, page 406, made this comment. It's really a summary of what we've just considered. He was actually talking about Luke chapter 17 verses 1 and 2, about putting a stumbling block before others and not regarding the little ones. He says, it is manifest that by the law of Christ we are under an obligation to consider the bearing of our actions upon others. If we are indifferent on this head, we may find ourselves unexpectedly confronted with unknown responsibilities in the day of account. And the point he's making is very simple. It emerges from this record, young people. He's making the point that we will be held accountable for the effect of our actions upon others, especially if that leads to their ultimate destruction. If we put a stumbling block in front of someone who stumbles and doesn't get into the kingdom, don't expect that matter, unless of course you've acknowledged it and been forgiven for it, don't expect Christ to smile on that at the judgment seat. We are responsible for the effect of our actions upon others. And make sure, therefore, that the decisions we make, unlike these men of Judah who have come along to compromise, you think of the effect of that. What's the signal that they're sending? To their own people, to their children, that it's okay to compromise with the world? That's the signal. Yeah, we're the servants of the Philistines. Let's go and serve them. The effect of that is horrendous upon the successive generations. They should have stood with Samson and dealt with the Philistine problem, and God would have given them the victory. But it didn't happen that way. It had to be left to one man who would chase 1,000. There's a very real lesson in that for everyone. So he says, swear unto me. It was for their protection, because he was intending to protect himself. Verse 13, he says this, and they spake unto him, saying, No, we will bind thee and deliver thee into their hand, but we will not kill thee. So they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock Etan. Now these 2 new cords here, Young's literal translates it 2 thick bands. So these are not some sort of flimsy little strings that anybody can just throw off. They bound him securely so that no ordinary mortal man could release himself from that bond. Now, that shows you something, that when in fact they just fell off his hands as though they were nothing, that God was involved in delivering Samson from the hand of the Philistines. And verse 14 says that when he came unto Lehi, so this Lehi was this narrow defile that ran from the rock Etam, the Philistines shouted against him. And the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon him. Now, where have we read that before? Well, we read it back in chapter 14, verse 19. That the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him. We read it in chapter 14 and verse 6. And the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon him. Now, 7 times in the record of Samson's life this happens. 7 is the number of the Spirit. Yahweh's Spirit, his power, his strength comes upon him. So here we've got a man who's overtaken by the Spirit of God. And my experience is this, that unless it is God that is working in my life, I don't do well in my struggle against the natural tendencies of the nature that I have in common with you. That's why, young people, it took me a while to get to this stage in life. That's why the first thing that I do every day, apart from some simple natural things that have to be done when you get out of bed in the morning, the first thing that I do is pray. Yeah, first. You know what I do next? Make a cup of coffee. You know why I make a cup of coffee? Because I'm going to sit down in a chair and read my Bible. That's what I do every day. Now I know, I say these things sometimes and brethren say, but I've got to go to work at 5:30 in the morning. Yeah, I know some brethren got to go to work at 5:30 in the morning. My son's got to go to work at that time in the morning. There was a time when I had to go to work early in the morning. It just meant I had to get up just a fraction earlier so that I could do some Bible reading. Well, I'm retired now. I don't work for Pharaoh anymore. Alright? I've given him away. And so now I don't have any restrictions on me. I don't have to get up and go and work for Pharaoh. So I get in a chair and I'll be there for about an hour in the morning, ruminating upon the word. You know why I do that? Not so I can tell you. No. Because if I don't, I have more difficulty during the day. That's why. I have learnt it by experience that if you want to handle the nature that you have, then the best way and the only way to do that is to make sure your mind has got some spiritual things in it at the start of the day. Simple as that. So I would counsel you, and I know that not everybody is in a position to do it. I know that not everybody may be inclined to do that. You know, we as a community have tended to leave our readings until the evening. You know what I used to tell my children? Because we had a rule in our family. Simple rule. You had to be at the breakfast table, because we ate as a family, not sort of eat where you like, when you like. We ate as a family. And to be there, dressed for school, 5 days, the school days of the week, at 7 a.m. So I had to go to work. I had to leave for work at 7:30. So we would get to the table, 15 minutes for breakfast, and then from 7:15 until 7:30, we would do one reading as a family. And the reason for that is the very thing that was mentioned in the prayers here, that Yahweh has given us our natural food, but far more important is our spiritual food. And we're trying to teach our children, yes, you need a full tummy, but you do need to go out into the world with something in your brain as well. So we would choose a reading. I mean, our children, when they're very young, you don't give them extensive expositions of the Bible. You just pick some very important, simple principles, and you deal with that first thing in the day. And I'll tell you a little story. You might have heard this one before. When my son was about 7 or 8, he's the fourth, the only boy in the family. He's about 7 or 8. And this particular morning, I had a dentist appointment, so I couldn't be there for the reading, and a little bit behind, so Margaret hustles the kids out to get in the car, drive them off to school. You know what my son said to her, standing at the front door? He said, "Mum, I can't go to school." "Huh? Can't you go to school?" He said, "We haven't done a reading." Now that's how kids might think, see. We haven't done a reading. It was part of his life. I used to tell them, the reason we're doing a reading this morning, and we'll do one again tonight after our evening meal, and I'm going to do one at work, and your mother's going to do it at home, is that we have 3 meals a day, don't we? And there are 3 readings. It's not a bad idea to have 3 meals a day in the spiritual realm. So, if you can get into that kind of habit, I'll tell you something, young people, you're going to have a whole lot better chance of dealing with the contentions of your nature, which are against the things of the Spirit. That's the lesson that I learned from Samson. So the Spirit of Yahweh comes mightily upon him. 7 times it comes upon him. And 7 is the Spirit number. It says in that verse, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his hands loosed, his bands rather, loosed from off his hands. So they just melted away. Rotherham says his bonds melted from off his hands. That's what the Spirit can do to the bonds of men, to the bondage of sin and death. That's what the Spirit can do. And it does it in this man's life. He's there as an example of what is possible. If only we will turn our minds to the Word of God. So we come to this magnificent victory with the jawbone of an ass. What does that teach us? Why not a sword? Wouldn't that be better? No. Jawbone of... Why the jawbone of an ass? Of all things. You ever picked up a green jawbone of it? Because it was green. This ass had only been dead for a little while. You know, it still had the putrefaction of the rotting flesh on it. You ever pick that up? No. You wouldn't, would you? But it was the only thing available. What does it represent? We want to explore that. You know, Israel was defenceless, except Yahweh worked through faithful men and women. We find that out in places like 1 Samuel 13, verses 19 to 20. Because the Philistines knew how to control Israelites. There was no blacksmith, it says in that record, throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. Well, you wouldn't want to get a Christadelphian a Bible. That might be dangerous. It could be dangerous with a Bible, a 2-edged sword. Oh no, don't do that. Make sure you encourage them not to read their Bible. Oh, fancy a Christadelphian with the Bible. That's the policy of the world. But all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share, his coulter, his axe and his mattock, and give them a sword. You know, in the book of Judges, God's strength is made perfect in weakness, human weakness. Ehud made himself a dagger, a 2-edged sword. He got to use the type, his head into the Bible. He's a wonderful type of Christ as Ehud, who made for himself a 2-edged sword and put it in the strongest part of his body. Ehud's thigh, of course, represented the mind of Christ, girding up the loins of his mind. Yeah, and he was a left-handed man. Now, sorry left-handers, but the left hand in the Bible is actually about human weakness. It's the right hand that's the symbol for divine strength and for divine authority. The left hand. And you got left-handers here? Of course you got left-handers. I was born, they say, a left-hander. But my parents insisted that I use my knife in my right hand, you see. So I'm basically ambidextrous. Left-handed is actually about human weakness. No confidence in the strength of man, which is represented by the right hand. There were 300 men with lambs in the time of Gideon, Judges chapter 7. 300 against 135,000? Come on. There was the ox goad of Shamgar in chapter 3 and verse 31. There was the woman who threw the millstone from the tower to kill Abimelech, the the imposter in Judges 9:53. There was a woman in a tent peg, jailed in the tent in chapter 4, 21 to 22. There was the social outcast, Jephthah, who became the deliverer of Israel. He's another wonderful type of our Lord Jesus Christ. There was a woman, a mother in Israel, Deborah, living under a palm tree, who delivers Israel. And there was the jawbone of an ass, here in Judges chapter 15, verse 16. So what do you learn from that? Well, you learn. It's not all about, is it, what man can do. It's about what God can do through the weakness of man. Because he is able to strengthen them to overcome the problems that beset them. That's the lesson. So let's have a look at these lessons in Lehi. Verse 15. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand, took it, slew 1,000 men therewith. So he found this in Lehi. Now what does Lehi mean? Jawbone. Alright? So the name of the place. Here he is in the jawbone, and he finds a jawbone in this narrow fissure that led to the rock Etam. It says a new jawbone. The word in the Hebrew means moist or dripping. And Rotherham translates it, the jawbone of an ass newly slain. Any volunteers? Well, you wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, would you? But you see, it's still green. It's not brittle like bones can become when they're dry. There was still life in the jawbone, in a sense. So what does this jawbone represent? Well, it's the jawbone of an ass. And the Hebrew word that is used here is kamor. And kamor, and there are several words, 2 or 3 words that do service for donkeys in the Old Testament. This one is a reference to the male ass. And the male ass is God's symbol for the nation of Israel, amongst other things. So when Samson picks up the jawbone, what do you do with the jawbone, by the way, when it's actually part of your body? Well, you can eat, but you can talk, can't you? My jawbone's getting a good workout today. Yeah, it's going up and down. All right, I'm jawboning to you, aren't I? That's the saying. So it's about speaking. What God is symbolising here is that this jawbone, which comes from a male ass, represents the power of his word in his people, if only they were inclined to do something about it, putting it in their brains. Alright? But they're dead. This ass is dead. But his jawbone's still green. There's still hope. And he picks it up and destroys 1,000 Philistines. One shall chase 1,000, said Joshua 23. So here we've got a wonderful way of presenting the possibilities, young people, that still existed. If only those men of Judah had said to Samson, using their jawbone, "We're with you, Samson. We will stand together against this mob." Then they could have chased away the problem of the Philistines forever. That didn't happen. So he put forth his hand. Samson was also being taught the lesson that he should have grasped corrupt and unredeemed Israel, represented by this dripping jawbone of an ass, and wielded them with God's power as an effective weapon against the Philistines. That didn't happen. One should chase 1,000. Deuteronomy 32, 29 and 30. Oh, that they were wise, says Yahweh through Moses, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. How should one chase 1,000 and 2 put 10,000 to flight, except their rock had sold them and Yahweh had shut them up? 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 8. And the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into the camp. And they said, woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing heretofore. This is when Hophni and Phinehas took the ark of the covenant to fight against the Philistines. Woe unto us, they said. Who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Yes, If Yahweh was with them, they could have smote the Philistines again in the days of Samuel. But that didn't happen, did it? Why? Well, because they were not united with the one aim. Samson, who picked up the jawbone of the ass, was being taught that if they had been united as a nation, as a brotherhood, then anything was possible, because God would be involved in it. Clear lesson that comes from that. And in verse 16 we read, and Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. I want you to notice the language that's used here, young people. You notice I've got in yellow there, these words. Have I piled them up in heaps? With the jawbone of an ass have I smitten 1,000 men. Who's doing this? Really? Not Samson. The Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon him. It's God's work in his life. But he sees it as his own. And at the times when you do have some success in dealing with the flesh and with the problems, it is all too easy for us human beings to attribute that to ourselves. It's not man that can affect the destruction of the flesh. It's not man. It's not in man. It's got to be the work of God. So here, Samson makes another mistake. This word I, he attributes the strength to himself. And he had to learn a very important lesson, and God teaches that lesson to him here in this very place. Verse 17. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking with his jawbone, that he cast away the jawbone of the ass out of his hand, and called that place Ramath-Lehi. Cast away the jawbone? Well, if he had seen it for what it represented, the nation of Israel, almost dead, so to speak, almost dry, he would have said, no, hang on to this. Because really what I want to do is go and join these people, rally them to finally crush the Philistines. That didn't happen. Now this place, Ramath-Lehi, at the end of verse 17, means the height of a jawbone. And then it says in verse 18, he was sore athirst, and called on Yahweh and said, Thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? Yeah, the Spirit which had given him the victory was in effect gone. And now he was left a weak mortal man, thinking he was going to die of thirst. So what does he do? He recovers himself, young people, and acknowledges his mistake. He corrects it. He says, Thou hast given. He attributes the strength to where it rightfully belonged. This great deliverance, this great salvation, translates rather hand. Shall I be delivered into the hand of the uncircumcised, this term of derision that we saw back in chapter 14, verse 3. So, where did you get that from? You know, it's in moments of crisis that you remember what you were taught when you were younger. And that's what happens here. It finally dawns on him. The penny drops. You know, my mum and dad did tell me that these people were the uncircumcised. He remembers that now in the crisis when he's about to die of thirst. So what happens here? Having acknowledged that it was God's strength that allowed him the victory, we read in verse 19, But God clave an hollow place that was in the jaw. Now, in the authorised translation, it says in the jaw. Actually, it's a name. As you see here, Rotherham translates it. This word hollow place means a mortar or a hole. Rotherham says, God clave open the hollow that is in Lehi. And so God gets involved. A hollow is created in this place where he'd had the victory and where he's now about to die of thirst. And he's given what he needs. There came water thereout, it says in verse 19. Water, of course, is the symbol of the Spirit. John chapter 7. Our Lord Jesus Christ said, any man believes in me, out of him will flow rivers of living water, as there came out of me. So it was a symbol of the Spirit. John tells us that in verse 39 of John 7. He spake of the Spirit. It's what's symbolised here. And that's why it says his Spirit came again unto him, and he revived. So his Spirit came back. It's the only real instrument, isn't it, of spiritual revival. And he calls this place En Hakor, the fountain of one calling, or the fountain of the crier. Yes, he's learnt to cry for help. That's what we've read, isn't it? Shall I die of thirst? Thou hast given this great victory. He's crying out for help. He now recognises, young people, where his strength came from. It didn't come from him. It came from his God. And then the record says, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. Now that reads, doesn't it, like an epitaph. Wouldn't it be terrific if the story of Samson came to an end at the end of chapter 16? When he's acknowledged that his strength came from God, he's been revived by the power of the Spirit there in the form of the water in Lehi, the place of the jawbone. Wouldn't it be terrific if that's where it ended? But look at what it says in verse 1 of chapter 16, which will be our subject for later on this evening, God willing, perhaps. Look what it says in verse 1. Then went Samson to Gaza and saw there a harlot and went in unto her. So later on this evening, when you've tired yourself out in the snow and you come in with freezing feet and hands, we'll get down and have a look at chapter 16 of Judges. And we're going to have a look at a very dark period in the life of this man, the Delilah episode. Quite apart from the harlot of Gaza episode, the Delilah episode, which leads this man to have his eyes taken out and put in chains to grind grain for the Philistines.